Chapter 5. In Journeying Often. Arthur Pierce's introduction to the future scene of his. Father Pierce's, he was a hasty one. He spent 4 weeks there, resting and awaiting the Indian escort from La Croix to take him to his destination. When they arrived, a party of 5 braves led by their chief, they set out immediately for their home village. It was in the dead of winter, and the trip, which was made on horseback, in Cossack style, as Pierce describes it, was an ordeal for the missionary. As we've already seen, his baggage had not yet arrived from Trieste, and in his light summer clothing he suffered intensely from the bitter cold. The biting north and west winds, which pierce bone and marrow, and the like of which is utterly unknown in Europe, froze all my fingers and toes. Besides, I was thrown from my unshod horse when it fell on the shore ice of Lake Michigan, with the result that the pains in my left arm, which was injured when, on the occasion known to you, our vehicle was overturned at Berkendorf, returned. They plagued me during the entire journey. The charming reception at La Croix, however, tendered us by the faithful the Saturday evening preceding the beginning of Advent, and which I cannot even begin to describe to you, caused me to forget all my sufferings. Hardly had the enthusiastic welcome given him by the village, the lusty shouts of the men, women, and children, and the yelping of the dogs died down than Pierce set himself to the task for which he had come to America. He paid scant attention to his own aches and ills. A firm believer in the merits of homeopathic medicine, he quickly healed his bruised arm by his own treatments. Then he plunged into the work which awaited him in the village. The chief, a Christian, showed him every courtesy. He took the missionary into his own lodge, where food was plentiful, and there was even a feather bed, though indeed Pierce was not one who felt much interest in such bodily comforts. Accompanied by the chief, he made the rounds of the village, and soon discovered that there was as much need for his medical skill as for his spiritual ministrations. Sickness abounded at La Croix, and he lost no time in trying out his remedies. Evidently, he met with considerable success, for he notes in one of his letters that of the 22 Indians he treated, only 1 died. This made a deep impression on the village and increased his prestige immensely. He had no trouble after that in getting the Indians to come to his services and attend instructions. His strongest ally, of course, was Chief Sharp Knife. The shrewd old Indian had not failed to note how Pierce worked his way into the hearts of his people by first attending to their bodily ills. Taking advantage of this favorable moment, the chief urged his people to embrace Christianity even as he had. Of him, the missionary writes with obvious affection, "I live perfectly at home and very cheerful with Mokumanich, Sharp Knife, chief of these savages, despite his name. He is a good-natured, venerable man of 70, and a very pious Christian, who is so fond of me that, together with his youngest son, a fine fellow, he accompanies me on practically all of my mission journeys and visits to the sick and dying, and personally seeks to persuade the pagans to be converted." 3. The prevalent sickness and the famines which struck the village from time to time were the result of ignorance and mismanagement. He was sorely tempted to remedy the situation by devoting a major portion of his time to this end, but the priest in him won out, and he recognized that the religious and intellectual training of the savages was the primary duty of his calling. If any time remained after this was attended to, he would utilize it to improve their social and economic status. The language barrier was perhaps the greatest obstacle in the way of effective missionary work. While the language of human kindness and sympathy often speaks far more eloquently than mere words, it does not suffice for the function of teaching. Pierce made one attempt after another to master the difficult Ottawa dialect, but the task seemed hopeless, and was further complicated by the fact that he was no longer young. He deplored this handicap more than any other, although in a great, strange country I am already quite at home among the Indians, and I lack nothing but a knowledge of their extremely difficult language, the need for which I feel more and more each day. Twice already, deterred from my purpose by words a yard long and by their arbitrary construction and placing, I gave up hope of ever acquiring this knowledge. And for the 3rd time, I made it a matter of conscience to master the language as well as I may. Father Baraga began only last fall to preach in Indian without an interpreter, after having studied the language untiringly for 5 years. In a letter which he wrote to a friend in Europe, he gave some examples of words which are to be found in the Ottawa, the task for which he had come to America. He paid scant attention to his own aches and ills, a firm believer in the merits of homeopathic medicine. He quickly healed his bruised arm by his own treatments. Then he plunged into the work which awaited him in the village. The chief, a Christian, showed him every courtesy. He took the missionary into his own lodge, where food was plentiful, and there was even a feather bed, though indeed Pierce was not one who felt much interest in such bodily comforts. Accompanied by the chief, he made the rounds of the village, and soon discovered that there was as much need for his medical skill as for his spiritual ministrations. Sickness abounded at La Croix, and he lost no time in trying out his remedies. Evidently, he met with considerable success, for he notes in one of his letters that of the 22 Indians he treated, only one died. This made a deep impression on the village and increased his prestige immensely. He had no trouble after that in getting the Indians to come to his services and attend instructions. His strongest ally, of course, was Chief Sharp Knife. The shrewd old Indian had not failed to note how Pierce worked his way into the hearts of his people by first attending to their bodily ills. Taking advantage of this favorable moment, the chief urged his people to embrace Christianity even as he had. Of him, the missionary writes with obvious affection, "I live perfectly at home and very cheerful with Mokumanich, Sharp Knife, chief of these savages, despite his name. He is a good-natured, venerable man of 70, and a very pious Christian, who is so fond of me that, together with his youngest son, a fine fellow, he accompanies me on practically all of my mission journeys and visits to the sick and dying, and personally seeks to persuade the pagans to be converted. The prevalent sickness and the famines which struck the village from time to time were the result of ignorance and mismanagement. He was sorely tempted to remedy the situation by devoting a major portion of his time to this end. But the priest in him won out, and he recognized that the religious and intellectual training of the savages was the primary duty of his calling. If any time remained after this was attended to, he would utilize it to improve their social and economic status. The language barrier was perhaps the greatest obstacle in the way of effective missionary work. While the language of human kindness and sympathy often speaks far more eloquently than mere words, it does not suffice for the function of teaching. Pierce made one attempt after another to master the difficult Ottawa dialect. But the task seemed hopeless, and was, further complicated by the fact that he was no longer young. He deplored this handicap more than any other. Although in a great, strange country, I am already quite at home among the Indians, and I lack nothing but a knowledge of their extremely difficult language, the need for, which I feel more and more each day. Twice already, deterred from my purpose by words a yard long and by their arbitrary construction and placing, I gave up hope of ever acquiring this knowledge. And for the third time, I made it a matter of conscience to master the language as well as I may. Father Baraga began only last fall to preach in Indian, without an interpreter, after having studied the language untiringly for 5 years. In a letter which he wrote to a friend in Europe, he gave some examples of words which are to be found in the Ottawa. Ningvanami kijigat, week kichito wendagoko het saint agwinki witong mihina gant gospel biat chilching wanagaboitan to kneel. The language problem preyed on his mind to such a degree that he began to feel it was not the will of God for him to be on the Indian missions. He even considered petitioning the bishop to grant him a transfer to a German parish. Fortunately, he did not follow through with this notion. Instead, he applied himself with a new determination to mastering the language. He attributes his ultimate success to an act of divine intervention. I did not, however, abandon confidence in God, whose aid I soon experienced. For soon after, I had an encouraging dream which filled my soul with consolation and rendered palatable and sweet all trials and difficulties. In this dream, I felt myself transported into a spacious illuminated hall filled with celestial splendor. There was an endlessly long table loaded with the most palatable food, and innumerable people of radiant countenance partook of the delectable viands. Hereupon, Father Benjamin, a Franciscan friar, a relative and friend of mine, clothed in a white cowl, joyfully entered the hall and accosted me. "Francis, in my vacation I have come to visit you and to bring you an Easter egg." This I took and found it exquisitely beautiful, transparent, and as pure as crystal. To my astonishment, I beheld in it miniature tiny fruit trees hung with numerous ripe fruits and wreathed with the most beautiful roses and other flowers. Engaged in a very joyous and sweetly delightful meditation on the beautiful present, I awoke in my bed and found my pillow moist with tears of joy. My watch showed exactly midnight. That this dream was not a mere phantasm, nor wholly the effect of natural physical causes, was shown by the result. Inasmuch as my spirit spurred me on to cheerful missionary labor and led to happy achievements and to a more easy acquisition of the Indian language. I was confirmed in my view of the higher inspiration of this dream by a sequence of dreams which followed from time to time. They let me realize how fatherly was the good God or my guardian angel who, whenever necessary, instructed, warned, exhorted, or corrected me for my faults. I do not deem it necessary to relate all the cases. What has been said is a sufficient hint for my confreres that while admitting our weakness, we should put our trust in God, who always assists us in his service and powerfully strengthens us in battling for the victory of Christ's kingdom against all the gates of hell. After this incident, the difficulty of language seems to have vanished. Father Pierce, it is true, never succeeded in mastering the Indian dialects to the same extent that some of the other missionaries did. Both Baraga and Scola spoke Ottawa and Chippewa fluently. But they were much younger men when they were called on to learn them and seemed, in addition, to have been gifted with a native talent for this study. However, Pierce in time was able to preach and hear confessions without the use of an interpreter. This was a decided advantage, for the latter arrangement was expensive as well as inconvenient. It exacted a heavy toll from the already slim purse of the missionary. The elimination of this added expense was a strong incentive for him to master the intricacies not only of the Indian dialect, but also of the English language. He wrote to a friend, "I am applying myself most energetically to its study, so that I may be able to dispense with the expensive interpreter whom I must pay 1 thaler for each sermon, 2 shill. Lings 30 Fahrenheits for each confession, in addition to 2 thaler, 4 Fahrenheits, 20 kr besides his board for every day spent on a mission journey. In an emergency I can and do hear confessions in Indian, but as yet I am not able to preach in that tongue. I can also speak a bit of English, and I understand the English books I read, but I cannot grasp its comically drawled and corrupt dialect. Consequently, I must instruct even the English-speaking Catholics through an interpreter for the time being, until, with the aid of God, I shall be able to do so in their own language." But if these difficulties plunged him into the depths of discouragement and despair, there was much in his work to give him real consolation. Not rarely did he find evidence of remarkable virtue among his flock, and this was always a heartening experience. Virtue, when it existed in an Indian, was frequently of extraordinarily virile caliber. There was something in the red man's character or temperament that made him capable of either attaining the heights of sanctity or plummeting into the very pit of immoral excesses. Pierce was not the only missionary to report examples of holiness among the children of the forest. Again and again we read in mission annals of Indians who endured great hardships to preserve their faith in an atmosphere that was not only pagan but hostile. Many of these trod the whole painful way of the cross and suffered death rather than tarnish their Christian virtues. Father Pierce relates the story of a 15-year-old Indian girl at La Croix, whose case he considered remarkable. Her name was Marie, and she lived with her pagan parents, who were bitterly hostile to the work of the missionary and lost no occasion to manifest their intense dislike. Their daughter longed to become a Christian, but was thwarted in her purpose by one obstacle after another placed in her way by her parents. In the end, however, she won them over by her quiet patience. Reluctantly, they permitted Marie to be baptized. Following her baptism, the young girl made such rapid strides in the cultivation of Christian virtue that Pierce was called upon to give her that spiritual direction which is reserved for souls already well advanced on the road to perfection. The pearl of my mission, Pierce calls her, adding that she was a model of piety in the village. Her conversion to Christianity brought new problems and new crosses to Marie, but none so hard to bear as the stubborn resistance of her proud parents to the overtures of grace. Father Pierce realized how much the conversion of her parents would mean to his young neophyte, and so exerted unusual efforts to win them over. But each time he failed. It seemed as if everything he did only stiffened their resistance. Eventually, they even left La Croix in order to keep their daughter away from his influence. Marie was heartbroken by this turn of events and pleaded with the missionary to help her in some way, for if she went with her parents, she would be completely deprived of every consolation of religion. But Pierce advised her to submit to their will without question, and assured her that God would reward such self-sacrifice with the favor she sought. A few weeks later, the girl was back at the mission. Her parents brought her on a litter. She was dying. An extraordinary change had taken place in the parents. They were thoroughly humbled by what they considered to be nothing less than an act of divine providence, and had only one thought in mind as they presented themselves to the priest. They begged him to pour over them the saving waters of baptism, and to intercede for them with God to restore health to their child. Yet they were completely resigned to the will of God in the matter, asking no greater favor, should he see fit to take, their daughter from them than to be allowed to follow her soon into eternity. The dying girl witnessed the baptism of her parents at her bedside. A few days later, she died peacefully, with a happiness that was in her heart visible on her countenance. Father Pierce writes of this incident in his book, The Indians of North America. Never did I know a more pious soul, never did I witness a more beautiful death than that of this pure young lady. Even when still a heathen, she committed no sin. After baptism, she confessed amid many tears her one fault, that once, when eating an apple, she had forgotten to make the sign of the cross. Her blessed death accomplished much good in my mission, confirmed the faithful in piety, and brought about the conversion of many pagans. Henceforth her parents lived very pious lives and zealously practiced their religion, but soon followed their daughter in death. Her father always wore the rosary around his neck, visited pagan lodges, spoke amid many tears of the mercies of God regarding his conversion and of the life of his blessed daughter, who thrice was granted the happiness of a vision of her transfigured Savior, and brought to me a number of Indians eager to learn the Christian religion. The winter of 1835, his first among the savages of northern Michigan, was a trying time for Father Pierce. This was the period of adaptation, and the priest went through a veritable baptism of fire from the elements. He was not accustomed to the rigors of an extreme northerly climate, for the cold season in his native Carniola was pleasantly mild in comparison. Moreover, this particular winter was unusually long and severe. The experience brought him face to face with a hardship that he learned in time to endure almost stoically, but in the period, horro dec. Her blessed death accomplished much good in my mission. Of noviceship it constituted a great trial. He writes of this first dreadful winter to Canon Sluga, reporting that many animals and human beings met death by freezing. He also notes that the ground froze to a depth of 6 feet, and even the wine froze in his chalice, as late as the feast of St. Gregory, March 6th. 11. That same winter Father Pierce undertook his first missionary journey. Before long, such journeys would become commonplace occurrences. Yet the thrill that he felt in his priestly heart the first time he sought out an Indian encampment in order to preach the gospel to the savages dwelling there never left him. In his native land, the people had come to him to receive spiritual ministrations. Here, in this new country, the situation was reversed. He was truly a shepherd dedicated to the task of seeking out his flock wherever they might be. During the 17 years that he worked among the Chippewas and Ottawas of Michigan, he covered thousands of miles, visiting one Indian village after another. La Croix and the other places to which his bishop assigned him were nothing more than bases of operation. The Indians who lived within the confines of these villages were for the most part already converts to the faith. They required little more than routine spiritual care. The real work of the missionary lay in the surrounding territory, and usually the area that came under his jurisdiction stretched out in a radius of hundreds of miles or more. Scores of savages, given over to every manner of pagan excess, made their home in this vast uncharted parish. To reach these souls, Father Pierce had to plod many weary miles in the course of each month. He soon came to know their favorite haunts, the places in the forest which invariably they chose for their encampments. Their smelly, smoke-filled, ill-ventilated and vermin-infested lodges held no mystery for him. He was as much at home in one of them as in his own simple little cabin, perhaps even more so. Without a map on which to trace these missionary journeys, the reader cannot fully appreciate the prodigious feat Father Pierce accomplished in taking care of the flock entrusted to him. No distance was too great for him, no journey too arduous. He was always ready at a moment's notice to take the road. The only consideration to which he gave any thought was that somewhere a poor savage needed his help and was calling for him. We who live in an age that knows the comfort and speed of modern travel, who take for granted our marvelous system of highways and railways, find it difficult to visualize the hardships and inconveniences encountered by Father Pierce or any of his contemporaries in making even the shortest trip. Yet the distances covered more often than not ran into 3-digit figures. We can only surmise what Father Pierce suffered in the way, a physical exertion as well as mental anguish as he raced against time to reach the bedside of some dying child of the forest. He was not addicted to self-pity, that all too human weakness so often indulged in by men of lesser stature. Perhaps his isolation in a wilderness where he was the only white man, within many miles, strengthened him against this failing. Certainly it had much to do with the development of that self-reliance, or perhaps we should call it dependence upon God, that seems to be characteristic of missionaries of every age. We must go to another source for our knowledge of the more personal side of his missionary career. As has been noted, Father Pierce was a prolific correspondent. The letters which he wrote to old friends in Europe from time to time indicate some of the hardships he suffered. In these warm human documents, he opens up his heart to tell his dear ones something of the new life upon which he has embarked in a land far away from them. There is no attempt at literary style. He writes simply and frankly of his life among the Indians and of his work. It is Pierce at his best. We see him as he really was, the lovable priest long past his youth who, in a burst of selflessness inspired by Christian charity, had sacrificed not merely personal comfort, but all that he held dear to bring the consolations of religion to heathen souls in America. When he speaks of the crosses he is called on to bear, it is not to complain, but to glory in the fact that God has chosen him to be an instrument of salvation to benighted fellow creatures. We get a new insight into the soul of this man of God. There are passages in those letters which he writes so matter-of-factly that are truly magnificent, revealing as they do his spiritual kinship with God's great heroes of the past. This is a facet of his character that can easily be overlooked in focusing the spotlight on his intensely active career as a priest and missionary. We quote the following as one example. A missioner in America is like a plaything in the hand of God. Sufferings and joys alternate constantly. No conquest for the kingdom of God can be achieved here without exertion and the sweat of one's brow. Our dear Lord permits us to be humiliated and prepared by much suffering before he employs us as instruments of his mercy in the conversion of the pagans, and allows us to enjoy the comfort of soul, their spiritual rebirth. Causes. I am perfectly content, in the most joyous sense of the word, in my present very arduous but also consoling field of labor. And I thank the Father of all for having led me with his protecting hand into this great continent, where so much good can be done for the salvation of the souls of others and one's own soul. I have no thought of envy for the comfortable life enjoyed by my European confreres, engaged in the cure of souls. Rather, I desire greatly to live and die in the midst of my holy Christian congregation in La Croix, unless Provi. Dense, through the voice of my most reverend bishop, should call on me to seek lost sheep elsewhere. All my people live in great humility and poverty, piously, sinlessly, entirely in the spirit of the pristine Christian community. All rejoice gratefully in the boon of the faith. Their departed forefathers and relatives have not seen and heard what the grace of Christ has wrought among the living. Ah, if I could but present this exemplary group of Christians as a living model to my own countrymen, particularly the boys and young men, pure as angels in the reception of the sacraments and in the practice of all virtues, in successful rivalry with the girls and the married folks. The situation is precisely the opposite to that we are accustomed to in Europe. Who can read this passage without being reminded of the writings of Thérèse of Lisieux? The little flower uses the same charming language in describing her relationship with God. Yet the two were totally unknown to each other. In fact, the life of one was fast coming to an end when the other's was just beginning. How explain this remarkable identity of expression, except by saying that the two must have been kindred spirits, both regarding God as a loving Father and themselves as playthings in His hands. The hardships and dangers encountered by Father Pierce, first in Michigan and then in Minnesota, are hardly more than alluded to in his correspondence. He describes with some attention to detail only those which made a deep impression on him. Others, which seemed trivial and unimportant, by contrast, he chose to ignore or refer to only briefly. But no vivid imagination is needed to surmise what some of these others were. St. Paul, the missionary par excellence, has epitomized them all in the masterful description he has given of his own apostolate. Among the Gentiles, he writes, and one can almost visualize Father Pierce in place of the apostle as one reads this magnificent passage. In journeying often in perils of waters and perils of robbers, in perils from the Gentiles and perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils in the sea, in perils from false brethren, in labor and painfulness, in much watchings, in hunger and thirst, in fastings often, in cold and nakedness. These were not unknown quantities in Pierce's life, as they are not unknown in the life of any missionary. He experienced each one of them in turn. Some were inconsequential, and he did not have to be a giant, physically or spiritually, to endure them. Others demanded almost superhuman strength and spirit. The wilderness that was Michigan and the other territory traversed by Pierce in the middle of the last century was no place for weaklings. Even the seasoned inhabitant of that region, whether he was an Indian scout or a white trader, had the common sense to acknowledge nature as the master, especially nature when it unleashed all its dormant forces. A constant threat to survival was the danger of getting lost in the wilderness. In the winter, when blizzards obliterated whatever tracks there were and transformed the whole region into a desert of blinding whiteness, the danger was increased 100-fold. Father Pierce records in the diary containing, "My most striking experience is an account of how closely he came to a tragic end when he and an Indian companion became lost in returning from an island off the La Croix mainland. This happened during his first winter in America. The two men were engrossed in conversation as they tramped along the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan and did not notice that they were getting no closer to the shore, which was hidden from their view by a thick fog. Unaware of their mistake, they walked for miles in the wrong direction, parallel to the shore. Their journey was made more wearisome by the mountains of ice, heaped up by the early winter storms, over which they had to climb. Night came upon them, and though their energies were all but spent, they did not dare to stop even for a brief rest. Hunger and cold gnawed at them and made them more miserable. The missionary found in one of his pockets 2 small crab apples, which he shared with his guide. His comments are of interest. Never, during my days in Carniola, did I derive such joy from the pleasurable science of fruit culture as I did from these apples, which, giving thanks to divine providence, I chewed by small bits, in order to induce a flow of saliva which sated my thirst and soothed my hungry stomach. The cold was so intense that the drops of perspiration falling from my forehead froze as quickly on my coat as wax drippings harden in the cold. A rest of a quarter of an hour would have brought fatal numbness. The harrowing ordeal ended happily, for the two reached safety after a day and a night of incessant wandering. Pierce had never lost courage for a moment. He believed with all his heart that God had not brought him all the way to America to perish even before his apostolate had properly begun. Pierce later wrote to his friend Sluga, "Throughout this unfortunate day I did not lose courage. Rather, I thought confidently, God, who cleanses my soul by this suffering, has surely provided a consoling joy for me, as he has so frequently done. And I was not mistaken. For when I had returned home, I found 2 pagan girls waiting for me, requesting to be baptized. Having instructed them in the most essential knowledge which they diligently acquired, I administered the sacrament to them the Sunday following." A few days after this incident, he received a new consolation in the arrival of a fellow priest from Mackinac, Father Flavian Bonduel. The latter had traveled the distance of 30 miles so that he and Pierce could make their confessions to each other. Lack of opportunity to receive the sacrament of penance was a deprivation that the missionaries took for granted when they signed up for service on the missions. Priests were scarce and stationed at widely scattered points. Sometimes they did not see a confrere from one end of the year to the other. Always, it was necessary for one or the other to make a long trip to provide this mutual consolation. Hardly less important than the spiritual benefit was the pleasure the two would get from the visit. It was an occasion, and Pierre celebrated in a fitting manner, without the need of anyone's wishes for a good appetite. My confrater and I ate a most delicious, large Lake Michigan trout, and he and I rejoiced for 3 days in the Lord in the pleasure of our companionship. The warp and woof of missionary life consisted of such ups and downs, pleasure intermingled with pain, tragedy, and near tragedy, often compensated for by good fortune, spiritual or otherwise. Pierce was supremely happy at La Croix, and by his own admission, there were days on his lonely mission outpost when he received more consolations than during his whole 20 years as a priest in Carniola. He loved his poor savages, and they loved him in return. Their response to his efforts to civilize them and introduce them to a better way of life was heartening. He taught them some of the beautiful customs of his own people. On Palm Sunday, they brought branches of the fragrant cedar to the church and begged him to bless them. Father Pierce was almost in tears at this touching scene, for only the preceding Sunday he had explained to them the Christian custom of blessing palms in memory of the Savior's triumphant entry into Jerusalem. On the Saturday following, they wanted to comply with his request that they bring bread and meat to receive the Easter blessing, but they had nothing to offer except a few potatoes and some fish. His heart was saddened at this proof of their poverty, but noting the downcast countenance of their shepherd, they quickly assured him that they did not mind being poor, that their one desire was to receive the Lamb of God at the altar on Easter Sunday. In the summer of 1836, he received orders from Bishop Ries to abandon La Croix and take charge of the mission at Sault-Ste. Marie. The bishop felt that no great harm would be done at La Croix by Pierre's departure. Most of the Indians had pulled up stakes and scattered through the woods to scavenge for food, since a heavy frost had destroyed the corn crop the preceding fall. Father Pierce was reluctant to leave shepherdless the ones who had remained behind, but putting aside his own will in the matter, he prepared to go from the place so beloved by him and proceed to the historic Sault,